Hello and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Before we start, I'd like to thank my latest subscribers on Patreon, Louise and Pablo, for their support, and all my other Patreon supporters. If you would like to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/A Mic on the Podium and you'll find many ways to subscribe, plus extra bonus material and episodes to enjoy, including this month's interview with my good friend and composer Ben Dawson. You can also support the show by leaving a review or rating on Apple Podcasts, which is greatly appreciated and will help the podcast reach a bigger audience. Today, I conduct a conversation with a Romanian conductor who started out as a violinist but has quickly become a rising star as a conductor. He is currently chief conductor with the WDR Symphony Orchestra in Cologne and soon to be music director of the Orchestra Nationale de France. It's a pleasure to welcome Cristian Macelaru. Christy, really nice to chat to you today.
Thank you, Mike. My pleasure.
I think, having looked you up online, it's fair to say you come from a rather big family. Were you all musical, or was it just something that hit you early in life?
Yes, I'm the youngest of 10 kids, and we were all musical. My parents um, really insisted on all of us playing musical instruments and studying music, actually. So we all went through the music school system in Romania, in communist Romania, which was actually quite wonderful to have this built-in system where there were specialized schools that offered a very, very intense music education alongside the regular curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting that you say that in the fact that, whenever you think of the political structure of communist states, Andris Nelson says much the same about his musical studies in communist Latvia, that, he had a wonderful musical upbringing. The rest of it, that's a discussion for another day, but at least musically, he said he had a great upbringing.
Yeah, I feel very lucky in this way. I think I'm not really sure what was the reason why the Eastern Bloc countries put such a huge emphasis on public education, specialized public education, I should say. But music was definitely very important, arts education. So my curriculum was really quite rich in enhancing my music education, all the way from I think I began when I was 5 years old with music theory. I started first, and then the next year I began writing and reading in school, and then music was always side by side. Music theory, history, instrument, choir, orchestra, chamber music, harmony classes. Everything was individualized per class, and we had one or two of those classes every single day of the week.
Wow.
Yeah.
Music in schools, coming from the UK, that's a hot topic of discussion. So at what point did your family and you leave Romania and move to the United States?
My family actually never left. I left by myself.
Oh, okay.
And I immigrated to the U.S. Well, I didn't immigrate at first. I just went there to study, and I finished high school. So my last year of high school was done at a wonderful arts academy in Michigan called Interlochen Arts Academy, and it's a private school that focuses on the arts and for arts education. And I finished my final year of high school there at the age of 17, and then I continued in the United States, but I went by myself.
Mm. And university after Interlochen?
Yes, of course, I went to University of Miami, and this was, it was at the time I didn't know if this was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. It happened to fit best at the time with what I needed. but in hindsight, looking back, and I'm a strong believer that actually at the university level, before you specialize in a master's degree or a doctorate degree, so in a bachelor degree program, one should really have the ability and the flexibility of being able to explore, to understand who they really are.
Mm.
So for me, this was a wonderful opportunity because of course, I was very focused on playing the violin. This was my instrument, and if I can say so myself, I was doing quite well. So I never struggled with the violin. I felt very comfortable with it. Um, but when I arrived at University of Miami, I had a beautiful 4 years where I took composition lessons every semester, and I conducted the orchestra all the time. And I had very supportive teachers that allowed me to explore all my other areas of interest. And in fact, they nurtured this self discovery phase to allow me to come to a conclusion to what I really wanted to be.
Mm. So it sounds very much like the violin was your top priority. Much like myself, I went to music college in the UK, and I
Mm,
wanted to become an orchestral violinist. That was that. But
mm,
whilst I was there, I did a year's conducting, and I was a joint first study composer. Would that be true
mhm.
for you as well? That you still, right now, to use a friend of mine saying, you still had violin goggles on. You were still, all it was about is playing the violin.
That's right. Well, I like to call myself a recovering violinist. Uh,
That's very good.
just
Yeah.
just because I still when I have the instrument in my hands, I get so much joy and pleasure out of playing it. But I never, while this was my dream for the first part of my life, I would say, I don't really have any desire to pursue it, to continue pursuing it on a professional level, because
Mm.
I think mainly because once I started conducting, I discovered the beauty of conducting and making music with so many people that I really don't miss the feeling of being on stage in front of. For me, violin playing is a personal thing for me at this point, and conducting is how I share
Yes.
my artistry, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Um, I since I gave up the violin 6 years ago and went full time to conducting, I think I've realised that the violin was just it was the vehicle that I used to get involved with orchestras. That actually orchestras was the
Hmm.
most important thing for me. And if I'd
Hmm.
happened to have been a wonderful percussionist, that would have also been the same. And if I'd happened to have been a wonderful oboist, but the violin was, to me, it wasn't everything. It just happened to be the means by which I could get involved with playing professionally in orchestras.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
from then on, it
definitely.
sort of morphed into being a conductor.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it's a I think it's an advantage actually for an orchestral player to become a conductor because conducting overall requires so much of this psychology of what it is like to be in an ensemble, sharing the stage with perhaps 100 other musicians that are all at the top of their game, or they're all quite extraordinary at what they do. And then where do you fit in, and how do you become an individual musician, and what does that mean? And I think it's important for every conductor to understand that psychology, so that then they can carry that understanding with them on the podium
Mm.
when they start to make music with those 100 uniquely gifted individuals that have their own strong identity, which is necessary to become a musician.
Having left university, I read that you're straight into the music profession as concertmaster of the Miami Symphony Orchestra. Is that correct?
Well, this was actually at the same time that I was doing my studies.
Mm.
When I arrived from Interlaken, I was 19 years old after I finished my 2 years there, and then I arrived in Miami, and I happened to see an announcement in the local musicians union paper that they were looking for a violinist, a substitute violinist in the Miami Symphony, which is a regional, at the time was a regional orchestra doing about 8 to 10 concerts per season. But because it was driven by an artistic director that had extremely ambitious goals for the orchestra, we actually ended up playing in Carnegie Hall a couple of times.
Oh, great.
And yeah, so it was a beautiful opportunity. So I went to the audition actually, just because I was looking for something else to do on the side and make a little bit of money. And I went to the audition, and the committee listened to my audition, and then they said, this is a crazy request, but we would like for you to, can you come back in an hour, and do you have any concertmaster solos that you can play? And I said, okay, I can play them now. So I just played, I think, Capriccio Espagnol and some Scheherazade kind of solos, and then they asked me to sight read a few things, and then they said, this we've never done this before, but we think you are the person that we would like to try out for concertmaster of our orchestra, if you would agree. And I said, geez, to show up for an audition for a substitute violinist and then to get offered the concertmaster position is it's not what you plan. Let's just put it this way.
It's fairly insane, yeah.
Yeah, it is. So, but their concertmaster had actually tragically passed away right before the audition, and the season was about to begin, and they didn't have any plans yet. And the conductor, as I said, was he was a visionary, to put it this way. And so I said, of course, I would love to be the concertmaster, and I did that for 4 years while also attending school.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story. So far, you've sort of dabbled in conducting a bit. At what point did it become something that was at least now a very, very, very important hobby, or did you even start thinking then, do you know what, I think I'd really rather conduct?
Well, when I left Romania, conducting was not even a thought in my head. I had absolutely no interest. I was obsessed with playing the violin, becoming a soloist. I was practicing, 8 hours a day, doing my Schradix and scales and all that. And then when I arrived at Interlaken, I remember the first day we had orchestra, and we were playing Manuel de Falla's Three-Cornered Hat Suite, number 2. And this is a fabulous school. And the feeling of a group of 100, 15 to 18-year-old young, gifted musicians that all of a sudden they get to play together, and it's an electrifying energy.
Yes.
And this was that first experience, and I immediately fell in love with the orchestra, as you said yourself. So I fell in love with the orchestra, and then I started thinking, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful. I really love this. And so after a year of playing in the orchestra, I stayed on at a camp, and I met a conductor there by the name of Larry Ratcliffe, who was unbelievably inspiring to all of us, the students at this music camp. We played Shostakovich Symphony number 11 under him, and I remember that's really the moment that I remember falling in love with the conducting profession, just from working with him and seeing how inspiring he was. So I went to him knowing that he teaches conducting, and I went to him and I said, look, I'm finishing school next year, and I would love to come study conducting with you. And he said, I was the concertmaster of this orchestra that he had conducted, and he told me, he said, look, conducting is such a difficult profession, and you need a lot of preparation before you decide to become a conductor as well. But there's also a time test that you need to take. And he said, what I would suggest, he said, you go back to school, study violin, get at least a master's degree in violin performance, try to get a job in an orchestra. And then if at that point you still want to become a conductor, I will take you on as a student. And so conducting from that point on was always a hobby in the back of my mind. But knowing that this was the person I wanted to study conducting with, I had to follow his advice,
Yeah.
which ended up being the greatest advice I ever received as a musician, as a young musician.
Yeah.
Taking my time and studying a musical instrument and playing in orchestras and learning music, acquiring knowledge about music. When I was at the University of Miami, I tried all these other things. I became very, very interested in composition, and actually, I almost gave up on my conducting dreams in order to become a composer. But then, yeah, it was strange how that shifted. But I continued, of course, playing the violin, and I would do conducting a little bit on the side. I would do a lot of composing. This was probably my main focus. And then the time came to say, okay, I need to go get a master's degree. And I remember filling out applications for violin master's degree, composition master's degree, and conducting master's degree. And of course, I came back to Larry Ratcliffe. So
Yeah.
I called him. I called him and I said, Larry, I finished my undergrad and I want to come and do a master's degree with you. He's teaching at Rice University. And Larry said, Christy, here's the thing. He said, you need to come and study and get a master's degree in violin performance with Sergiu Luca, who was a wonderful, incredible Romanian violinist that taught at Rice University. And he said, once you get this master's degree with him, then I will take you on. There's no audition, anything. I will just take you on as a student, but you have to study with him first. And it just, of course, this was very frustrating, right? For
Yeah,
a
of course.
22-year-old aspiring conductor, yeah. So then I sort of gave up on composition, and I gave up, or I put aside my conducting, and I applied to Rice University. I was accepted into the master's degree program with Sergiu Luca, who thinking back, I always feel like he was the person that taught me how to understand music, how to comprehend music, and I feel like in the lessons with him, I did. And the other thing that was frustrating is the first time I met him, he asked me. He said, I hope you know this, but I don't teach a 2-year master's degree program. It's a 3-year degree program with me. And I said, okay. And
The goalposts keep moving, don't they?
it kept moving. But he was also very fair with me because he asked me. He said, why do you want to study violin with me? And at this point, I was already quite frustrated, and I said, well, honestly, I need to study with you because if not, Larry will not teach me conducting, and that's my dream. And he said, I appreciate you being honest, and I think we can do something with this. But what was fascinating about that is, first lesson started, and he had a very, very well thought out plan and method of teaching. So the first lesson started, and he said, okay, now I'm going to teach you how to hold the violin properly. And this is Kreutzer number 2, and this is how you play open strings. And he didn't care that I was going to become a conductor. We started from the very basics, and I worked harder on the violin those 3 years than I had at that point, to that point in my life, which was exactly what I needed. It was exactly what I needed to become a conductor. And in the process, he taught me music. He taught me how to understand music. What does it represent? And I feel like it was the first path into my discovery of what I like to refer to as the essence of what music is and what music represents.
Eventually, I'm assuming, therefore, once the goalposts stopped moving, that you got to study with Larry Rachleff. So what was Larry like? What was his teaching approach like? Was he very much into stick technique and gesture, or a more holistic overall approach?
Well, Larry has one guiding principle that is so powerful, and I think it goes very deeply into the art of what a conductor is. And his guiding principle was that the he said the stronger the music screams inside you, the better or the more clearly your body will find a way to show it.
Yeah.
and and that's so true, and he said, look, I can teach you the gestures of conducting literally in about 5 minutes,
Oh.
and then the rest you have to explore on your own. So what was wonderful is that once I got to Rice University, even though I was studying violin, Larry is also one of the most generous people I've ever met. And he gave me conducting lessons for my 3 years as a violin student as well,
Mm.
after taking me on as a real conducting master student. and and in those 3 years, I would say most importantly, and what I learned the most is his approach to teaching conducting. He said, okay, come and watch every rehearsal. Come and then give me comments. At the end of the rehearsal, you listen in the hall, and I don't want to hear anything that's good. I want to hear what are the things that we're not yet doing well. I
Mm.
need you to. So I would take copious, and then after the rehearsal, we would sit together for about an hour, and I would say, well, the French horns were late here, or this was this, or this was too loud, or the articulation doesn't match here. And the most wonderful thing is then at the next rehearsal, he would address every single comment that I gave him, but he would address it in a way that I didn't even imagine would fix that problem. So I would hear that the French horns were late, and instead of telling the French horns, you're late here, he would find a way to address fixing that issue by focusing on perhaps another instrument that needs to help the French horns, or teaching them to listen to the right instrument in order
Mm.
for them to not get behind. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it was because then I studied with Larry for 2 years, and then I stayed on as his assistant for 3 years. So this was an 8-year long training period,
Mm.
side by side with Larry, where I have to say, because Larry is so generous, I think in 8 years of studying with him, I probably talked to him every single day about something that had to do with music, with conducting, with life, with all these aspects that go into forming a conductor. And I really feel like his approach is actually a side by side mentoring, which is why he only takes a couple students, really,
Yeah.
every 2 years. He doesn't have a lot of students, but because he is so focused on the idea of discipleship, which is how music used to be taught,
Yes, it did.
and I think it's so important. And then he would do the same. I would be on the podium conducting my rehearsal, and he would be sitting in the audience and taking notes, and then we would talk after those at the end and say, okay, now figure out a way to address these issues, but these are what the issues are.
Yeah.
So I learned so much about rehearsing and music and studying, and of course the conducting technique. But this was, in some ways, this was the first thin layer, and then there was so much underneath that he focused on.
Mm. That sounds very immersive. It also sounds like you're finding ways to get the orchestra to play together by listening more, which is definitely something I'm very much
Mm.
in favour of, rather than just saying "watch my beat," which I've never really been in favour of. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, it sounds like an amazing sort of program. I'm wondering, having
It,
spent
it is.
that long with Larry, when you come to have masterclasses and sessions at Tanglewood and Aspen with David Zinman, Raphael Frubeck de Burgos, Ollie Nusson,
Mm.
um, did they just add an extra layer on top, or was it that thing where you take everybody's points of view because they're all so different and sort of put them together in your
Yeah.
own brain?
Well, it's fascinating because in none of my times, Aspen or Tanglewood, I never had a conductor that I considered a mentor or a teacher.
Mm.
I've never had any of them talk to me about my technique. This was never, I don't know why it was, I'm sure it wasn't great, but it was never an issue. And with David, and this is what I learned, and it was frustrating with David Zimmern for 2 years because I remember, and I have tapes, and
Yeah.
sometimes I go back and I listen just for fun. Um, and David was such, to him, the most important thing that he talked to me about. It was frustrating at the time, but now I get it. Now I
Yeah.
understand the importance of this. David always talked to me and said, Christy, you have to find the right tempo for this piece to work. It
Mm.
has to have the right tempo. He said, if you don't, he said 99% of the struggle in a piece of music is if it doesn't click in the right pulse. It has to be just right for the musicians to be able to lock in. And it killed me for 2 years. I it didn't matter what I was conducting. David would say, now, was that the right speed for this piece?
Yeah.
And he just had this way of reminding me of this in a very obsessive way. And now I think there is an unbelievable amount of truth to that, because it speaks so much to not just finding the right tempo or the right pulse or the right speed, but it also it speaks a lot about how do you listen to an orchestra to
Mm.
understand what they need, and to understand why is it that this doesn't work.
Yeah.
And it was very deep that way. And then with Maestro Frubeck de Burgos, who I loved and admired tremendously, um, he never talked about technique, but he was a true master of technique. He
Right.
was he was one of those people that um, orchestras loved playing with him because his technique and his way of conducting brought so much comfort to the music making process, because you knew exactly where the baton will land and why and how, at what time. And it was with surgical precision that this happened every single time. And I remember the first time I conducted in a masterclass for him, we did Capriccio Espagnol, and he came and he sat in the principal second violin chair
Mm.
just so he can be right under my nose,
Yeah.
and watched me. And he said, just do a rehearsal. It was a Tanglewood. I said, do a rehearsal and then we'll talk in my dressing room afterwards. And I said, okay. And I did my rehearsal. And then when we finished, about 45 minutes later, he said, now come to my dressing room. And I went to my dressing room and he looked at me and he said, Christian, he said, I have to tell you one thing. He said, you make a beautiful sound with the orchestra. And he said, whatever you do for the rest of your life, he said, everything else you will learn. He said, but don't lose this sound. He said, do
Mm.
not lose this sound. He said, listen for this sound. And when you feel like it's not there, think about how you're conducting.
Yeah.
And it was for the first time in my life that I had heard someone refer to your gestures or your persona on the podium actually creating the sound or
Yeah.
influencing the
Mm.
creation of the sound. But that is very true. It's incredible to hear different conductors conduct and how they actually get a different sound from the orchestra. It's one of the great unknowns, I think, about what is it that a conductor really does, because you can't really define that. What is it that a conductor does to get a certain sound, but somehow they do get a different sound.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
And then Ollie was, I would say Ollie was just an unbelievable cheerleader, I
Yeah.
should say. He was so incredibly supportive. And I remember doing Colin Matthews' piece, and he was just so supportive. And after the concert, came to me and um, I want to use exactly the words that he did. I'm not sure. Trying to make sure this podcast is rated appropriately, but he said that was just unbelievable. He said so. And I remember that meant a lot to me, because for a young conductor, a true compliment from someone that you look up to, like All in Us, and it goes such a long way. It's very necessary, and I really deeply believe that young musicians do better with encouragement than with negative reinforcement.
From 2011 to 2017, you have an association with the Philadelphia Orchestra. You start as assistant conductor, then become associate conductor, and then conductor in residence. What was that like, getting to learn to know an orchestra from the inside? What was the role? Was it with the orchestra, or was it with the music director? And how did they help you? How did the players of the orchestra sort of help you at all?
Well, this was an unbelievable learning experience for me. It was also a very interesting set of circumstances. So in 2010, actually, I took an audition for cover conductor for the
Right.
Philadelphia Orchestra, and it's one of the only orchestras actually in the U.S. that will hold an audition in order to identify cover conductors that would come in for 1 week just to be on call in case something happens to the conductor.
Okay.
Most orchestras just offer that to a young conductor on the basis of a recommendation or at someone's request. But Philadelphia Orchestra insists on having an audition to pick this pool. So I had gone in for an audition for cover conductor, and I was on the list. I went and I did a few weeks, and then about a year later, they asked me to come in for an audition for assistant conductor.
Mm.
And I said, sure, yeah, I would love to. So I went and I did my audition for assistant conductor. Actually, this audition was in 2010, and then they
Yeah.
said, well, the orchestra would like to, we're going to go about this in a different way because it was the first time that the musicians actually were the ones voting. Charles Dutoit was the chief conductor at the time, and he was not part of the process. He didn't want to be part of the process. And the
Right.
musicians then were going to be part of the process, which only meant that not all musicians, I mean, they didn't have a unanimous opinion. And they said, we're going to do a 1 year trial. And we have two finalists, and we're going to split the work in half. And then we'll invite you for half of the work, and we'll invite the other candidate for the other half. And then at the end of the year, the orchestra will take a vote and then see who wins the job.
Right.
And I said, my gosh, this is the longest longest audition for an assistant. But it's the Philadelphia Orchestra. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
So I did all of that work, and then I still remember it was in March of 2011, and I received a phone call from the vice president for artistic planning, and he called me and he said, "Now I have great news for you." He said, "You have won the audition. The orchestra has voted, and you will become our assistant conductor." He said, "Now, tomorrow morning, there will be some news coming out of Philadelphia, and I want you to not be worried about this. And give me a call tomorrow if you want to talk about it. But just so you know, hopefully everything will be fine."
Mm.
And I was thinking, geez,
What's
what
that
is the
gonna
news?
be?
Yeah. So I wake up the next morning, and the news is Philadelphia Orchestra files for bankruptcy. Right.
Wow.
Exactly. And it's a slightly different kind of bankruptcy in the US than it is in Europe. It's basically bankruptcy protection. So it's a restructuring of the organization but you are protected from your debts and all the other circumstances that led you to this financial crisis. So what that meant actually, and at the time I completely panicked, and my wife said, well, how are we going to move from Houston, where I was working at Rice University, and she was a professor at the University of Houston. And how are we going to move to Philadelphia on the assistant conductor salary with an orchestra that just filed for bankruptcy? How can this happen? And I said, well, we have to try. I said, if I don't try it now, what am I going to do? So we moved to Philadelphia. And the wonderful thing about filing for bankruptcy is they had to restructure absolutely all the costs, which meant that while in the past they had an associate conductor and an assistant conductor at the same time, and they had guest conductors come in to do all things that had to do with conducting, all of a sudden they had reduced everything to the duties of the assistant conductor. So I became assistant conductor, and in that first season, I conducted 25 different concerts with the Philadelphia Orchestra,
which is
remarkable. Yes,
and that's also the sort of assistant conductor role that, in my mind, I mean, 25 is an awful big number, but it's just sitting around watching rehearsals all day doesn't make you a better conductor. Well, I mean, it does make you a better conductor, but actually conducting makes you a much better conductor. And you learn by making mistakes, and the orchestra will know he's our assistant. He's going to do things well. He's also going to screw up, and they're open to that. They know that, which is how you learn. I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and the orchestra also, I think, because they had been the ones that picked me, they felt they were so involved in talking to me and giving me feedback. I remember one of the first feedbacks that I got that has stayed with me so strongly in my mind. There is a wonderful gentleman that is a double bass player in the orchestra, but he's a very, very direct and very honest and wonderful, but very direct and very honest person. And I had conducted my first family concert, and for Philadelphia Orchestra, it's a 90-minute rehearsal for a 60-minute show, basically. The morning of, the concert is at 11:30 in the morning, and you have a rehearsal that goes from 9 until 10:30 with an hour break, and then the concert. So I went through everything, and I had about 15 minutes left on the program. In the rehearsal. And I was trying to manage the time as best I could so that I don't run out of time, which is why I was sort of rushing through everything to get to the end of the rehearsal. And I finished, and then, looking at the time, I realized that I had 15 minutes left. And I said, well, I think we're ready, and thank you very much. We'll finish early. And I finished, and I walked into my dressing room having the concept in my mind that musicians always talk about how genius a conductor is that finishes the rehearsal early.
Yeah, especially in the UK, I can tell you that. Yeah.
But, I arrived into my dressing room, and this gentleman came to me and he said, I don't know what experiences you've had in the past. He said, but this is the Philadelphia Orchestra. He said, we want to sound good. Was it really nothing that you could have done in those 15 minutes to make us sound better? Was this really the greatest thing that you've ever heard? And I said, no, I think there were things that I still could have fixed. He said, exactly. He said, next time you use those 15 minutes because we want to sound the best we possibly can. And if you give us 15 minutes early, yes, there will be those that will like it on a superficial level, but you are also robbing us of 15 minutes of being able to sound our best. So think about that. And I think it's a really great balance that a conductor needs to reach. Of course, if I feel like the orchestra has really done their best and we've achieved all that we could have, and there's room left at the end of a rehearsal, of course I'm not going to sit there and kill the orchestra. But if you are in a situation where you are the only one that feels like perhaps it's time to end early, maybe this is not a good idea. And this was I've had experiences like this over and over with really great orchestras where they would much rather sound their best than go home 15 minutes early. And there is a balance, as I said, but it's also a great lesson. But like this, there were so many lessons that I learned in Philadelphia. I remember musicians coming to me that I had never talked to before, but halfway during my first season, they would come to me after one particular rehearsal and they would say, "Now, did you see what happened in the rehearsal today?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay, never do that." You know, or things like this, you know.
Yeah.
And yes, you know, when you're sitting and watching the rehearsals, you have a feeling of, okay, I shouldn't do this ever, or this seems like a good idea. But it's nice to have the reinforcement of a comment from someone in the orchestra that actually had the experience of being part of that rehearsal. Then they come to you and they say, okay, don't allow something like this to happen, or
Mm.
you know, make sure that you address the orchestra in a way where you never get back an answer like that, you know,
Yes.
or little psychological things actually that speak to the successful time that you can have during a rehearsal.
I have a question for you because it's much related to your time there, I'm assuming. Um, and I asked this question to Karina Kanalakis because the three of us were all in the same boat of all having been professional violinists who then went on to
Mm-hmm.
be conductors. And the question is pretty much the same as I asked her. Many people would say that we have an advantage being string players and conductors in the fact that learning to play a string instrument is extremely difficult. There's so many nuances with the bow and contact and vibrato and all of that. Whereas I would counter that argument by saying, yes, that's probably true, but then I have to go around the rest of the orchestra and ask, how does a horn player do this? Why is that note on the bassoon always flat? Where do you hit your timpani to produce that sound and not that sound? During your 6 years at Philadelphia, were you constantly asking, or had you done a lot of this before at university with Larry Ratcliffe?
Um, yes and no. I mean, you know, the wonderful thing about conducting an orchestra like the Philadelphia Orchestra is that every person that is on that stage is really a master of their own instrument.
Mm.
And the conductor then, I believe, has the role of shaping the artistic vision, and then they will be able to figure out how to do it. You know, my violin teacher, and I am answering your question, but I'm going around
That's right.
the long way. uh, my my violin teacher, Sergio Luca, I remember at an instance, I was studying composition as well with this composer, which he had commissioned to write a sonata for him,
Mm.
and I was so curious how the interaction went between the performer and the composer. So I asked my composition teacher. I said, "How was your conversation with Sergio about writing the sonata? Like, what did he tell you?"
Mm.
And he said, "You know, it's really interesting. I was trying to ask him about, you know, is this possible? Can you do this on the violin? Is it, you know?" And Sergio wrote me back one sentence, and he says, "Your job is to write the music. My job is to figure out how to play it on the violin. So
Yeah.
write whatever you want, and I will figure it out." And I use this concept a little bit in conducting. You know,
Yeah.
I think a lot of the time traditions started where conductors did not trust that the musicians had the ability to figure out how to do it on their instruments. So they were trying to give the answers that were not necessary to give.
Mm.
I think conductors need to shape the artistic direction and the artistic vision of a certain piece, and then it is the musicians at that level, it is their duty to figure out how to do it on their instrument, as long as it is clear to them what is happening.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
of course, this is different depending on the level of the orchestra or the ability of the ensemble or the role that you have, you know. But in Philadelphia, I have to say, one thing that I learned is that the conductor that had a more clear artistic vision was the one that actually was loved more by the musicians,
Mm.
because then it was very clear for them what to do. And I had many instances where I conducted something and I would say, "Is this possible, you know, what I'm requesting?" And the musicians would say, "Yes, it is. I need a day to figure it out."
Yeah.
And then they would, and it would be amazing. And stuff that you always hear, traditions cutting corners here or there, or not cutting corners, but making adjustments, right,
Yeah.
into the musical score in order to give the ability to the musicians to do something that it's easier, right? Exactly how, and this, I early on in my career, I decided as a violin player that I knew exactly how I wanted the bowings to work, right? So
Yes.
I created my own parts for all the classical repertoire that I was conducting at the time. And then I was so proud. I went to the first orchestra and I conducted. It was fantastic, right?
Mm.
And I felt so good. And then a year went by and I took my material to the next orchestra and nothing worked.
Yeah.
And I said, how can this be that nothing worked? And then I realized, hang on a second, it's not about the direction that the bow goes in always. I mean, this is true sometimes,
Yeah.
but every orchestra will have a different way of executing the musical idea. And surprisingly to me, my ideas had changed in 1 year,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and that's the problem with creating a set that you don't update. So now I'm a little stuck because I still like to send my own set to the orchestras, but now part of my preparation for that week is to actually revise the set
Yeah.
because my concept changes based on what I have learned during that 1 year. So it's a even with string players, which I feel like on the violin, I know exactly how to do things. Even with this, I usually write a note to the concertmaster and I say, these are my bowings. Please use them as a starting point to understand what my musical concept is.
Yes. Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you if you feel like in your orchestra it would be better represented this other way, feel free to change them. So I hope this answers the question. I mean,
No, it does. Yeah.
I learned a lot about all instruments when I was studying composition, actually, and this
Mm.
is something that I think served me really well in learning about different instruments by writing for them.
Yes.
Also, I was lucky enough that all the members in my family played musical instruments that were diverse. So I remember as a little child talking to them about, what's a French horn, and my brothers explaining to me why is it difficult for a French horn to play above, a certain note on the in the
Mm.
register, and how do you make the jump, So I never, as an assistant conductor, maybe I should have, I don't know, but I never felt the need to find out more about instruments that I didn't know because I felt like I needed to focus a lot more on the musical interpretation and the artistic ideals of the piece, and give the musicians the trust and the freedom that they will figure out how to do it on their own instruments.
In 2019, you become chief conductor of the WDR Symphony Orchestra Cologne, and all things being somewhat back to normal, you're due to start as music director with the Orchestre Nationale de France in 2021. So, two exciting jobs. Are you looking forward to doing both of those together at the same time? And what challenges do they present to you?
Um, well, when I started in Cologne in 2019, I really was not anticipating that I would add another job so
Mm.
soon. This was definitely not something that was my plan. But there's so much that has to do with fate, and so much that has to do with listening to your instincts a little bit. I'm a strong believer in that, and it just felt right when I went to Paris and I did two concerts with ONF, and um, it just felt like the right thing.
Mm.
And they approached me in the same way, and they said, look, we weren't in a really desperate music director search. This was not we weren't trying to find someone right away, but when you worked with us, it just felt like the natural thing to do, and it felt good, and we want to go ahead with it. So that's the first. It's sort of like my little disclaimer, right? Um, but and in Cologne, I it was a similar thing when I started in Cologne, when I got the job in Cologne, because the first time I came to conduct the orchestra, VDR Symphony Orchestra. I conducted, and it was a very good concert. But I didn't think that. I mean, I didn't feel like this was one of those weeks where I have to make sure that I don't know, I need to win a job and it's an
Hmm.
audition. No,
Yeah.
it was very relaxed. We did Rite of Spring. I remember it was on the program, and Tandun percussion concerto with Martin Grubinger, and I think it was Tandun. No, maybe it was no, it was Avner Dorman. Sorry,
Hmm.
and but the week was very relaxed, and I just remember loving the music making process and loving the idea that there was absolutely no pressure, you know. And I think we've all been in circumstances where it's a fabulous orchestra, it's a good conductor, but it's a pressure kind of situation, and
Yes.
then nobody does their best,
Huh.
you know, because the orchestra wants to not criticize, but their enjoyment level is skewed by their criticism
Huh.
of the person conducting. So when you're looking at criticizing a conductor, or finding something about a conductor, you will definitely find something that you don't like. You
Yeah,
know,
that's true.
it's human nature. You will find
Yeah.
what you're looking for,
Yeah.
right? Whereas if you're just looking at enjoying the music making process, that's exactly what you will discover as well.
Hmm.
So it's a, you know, I've been in many situations where I would go in and I would say, okay, this uh, intellectually speaking, this feels like it's a job that I would love to have. It's an orchestra that I would love to work with and to be my home orchestra, so to speak. And then you know, it just did not feel right. It felt
Yeah.
like a square peg in a round hole, you know. But in both these cases, it just clicked. It felt right, and then I feel like I will continue doing both of them until it continues to feel right.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, I have no idea what that is. I mean, you know, people have created all kinds of models for themselves and said, yo, you know, a music director should not be longer than 10 years or 12 years. But then, you know, you look at unbelievable connections that have been created between fabulous conductors and fabulous orchestras who went on for 25 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean that they happen less often these days, and I don't really know why that is. But yeah, I mean you can't turn around and say that Rattle was at the CBSO too long, or
There you go.
Mark Elder has been 20 years at the Halle. You can't say that, or
Exactly.
you know. And what's interesting, going back on
Exactly.
something you said, is and I remember this as a player when it came to when Rattle left and we needed a music director, and then when Sakayama left and we needed a music director, that you could feel that there were certain people who would come in a week's work conducting, and they were trying too hard because they knew there was a job going.
That's right.
But also, you're right in the fact that every week after the music directors announced they're resigning and they're going in 2 years' time, every week you're looking harder at a conductor, thinking, "Well, are you going to be the person?" And you're right. You pick on something that might be completely immaterial because you've forgotten about the music making process, and you can pick on
That's
one
right.
aspect of them. Yeah, it's difficult. It's a difficult time. So it sounds like you've got those two orchestras you've fallen in love with, and they've fallen in love with you. Just purely by happenstance, and not because it happened to be the time when
Exactly.
which is the loveliest way, isn't it?
Exactly. In fact, when I went to Paris the first time, I didn't even know that they were considering looking for a music director. This was not
Uh,
even, you know, I went to them because I wanted to meet ONF. I mean, it has an unbelievable tradition with all the conductors that have worked there, and it's a incredible orchestra, and of course I was very happy to go there,
mm,
and then I went and we did Mahler 10. I remember it, the Adagio from Mahler 10 is the final piece on the program. It was a very eclectic program, I should say, with
mm,
a lot of contemporary music that then finished with the Adagio from Mahler 10. And I remember in the performance, the Mahler 10, I could not believe my ears
mm,
how beautifully everything gelled, and just everything worked, and it was absolutely one of the most stunning performances that I was part of. And I felt at the same time like I was not working hard to make this happen. Like it just everybody was giving the same amount of energy and dedication to this,
Mm.
and this really really stuck in my memory. So when they came back to me and they said, "Look, they loved that concert. They would like for you to come back as soon as possible because there might be something in the future." I was blown away. I mean,
Mm.
I understood in reference to that concert, but I was like, really, you must be joking. I said, this certainly it's not going to be. It's not going to go. It's not going to. This is not going to happen. It's
Mm.
impossible. And then I went and I did the concert, and I think after the first rehearsal or the second rehearsal, I don't remember, the committee from the orchestra came to talk to me and they said, this is, would you tell us if you would be interested in becoming our music director? And I said, can I tell you tomorrow? So can I ask my wife? Can I ask my wife about this?
Mm.
Um, and I did. I mean, absolutely. And I still just the same. And I love the fact that both the Vedder Symphony and ONF, they share one thing that I think these two orchestras and I do as well. We share in common. There is the only way I can describe it is there is an absolutely abandonment of passion. um, I don't know if this is the right description, but it
That's a
feels
good description. Yeah.
in the moment of the performance, it feels like it feels so beautifully connected and on a level that is so intimate,
Mm.
that I feel very hopeful about this being this way for the future.
Well, going to an analogy here, and this goes to show how how an orchestra and a conductor gets together. To use this
Hmm.
analogy, is that I happened to be in Birmingham when the CBSO had a blind date with Andris Nelson, to use this metaphor, and we fell in love at first sight. But that doesn't happen very often. It sounds like you and Vedder and ONF fell in love, but you didn't even know you were going on a date, which is also, it's a lovely, lovely way of
That's
finding
right.
a partnership. And I think it worked.
Yeah.
It can work in every way. I think the difficult one is, as we've discussed, is when you go on. It's speed dating, basically. Guest conducting is
Yeah.
speed dating, and you're shoved in front of somebody who's looking for somebody, and you're looking for somebody, and there's pressure in the room, and I think that's hard. I think that's very difficult to be yourself, and also for them to be themselves.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And it's so important that the musicians feel the comfort from the podium,
yeah,
feel the comfort of being able. I always say, for me, a great interpretation is the moment where the musicians are comfortable enough to play their best.
yeah.
And I would much rather take this interpretation over any ideas that I've ever had about music, because it's so much better to listen to a Brahms symphony when really everyone is comfortable to play their best than when they are uncomfortable, but they're trying to create a musical phrase that was imposed on them
Mm,
by the conductor.
yeah.
And I think that is what orchestras feel, when you have that balance of comfort uh, paired with leadership in the artistic sense, and then they naturally want to follow that leader that is in front of them.
Mm.
And I think that's the best analogy for me to what is it that makes a conductor successful.
I met you backstage at the
Hmm.
Symphony Hall in Birmingham when you were there conducting the CBSO one week, and then at the end of the week you conducted a concert with the CBSO's own youth orchestra, and I had prepared Bartok's Wooden Prince for you. This was in 2016. I see that you
Hmm.
also conduct the World Youth Symphony Orchestra at your old alma mater, Interlochen. What is it
Yeah.
about youth orchestras that brings you back and means that you are happy to work with them when some of our conducting colleagues would rather not conduct youth orchestras?
Yeah, for me, it's very simple. I think our priority as artists, as conductors, is to pass on our knowledge and to pass on inspiration to the younger generation to continue the work that will be necessary after we are not there anymore. I think
Mm.
this is priority number one. And for anyone that feels like, the education aspect is sort of a side thing that you have to reluctantly agree to do every now and then, I think they are in the wrong mindset
Mm.
because without relying on the younger generation to continue the work that we hopefully are wanting to continue, what is the future to look forward to? I mean,
Yeah.
so I think it's a selfish approach to music making where you don't put an emphasis on education, and I put as much of an emphasis on education as I can. I am the artistic director and the principal conductor of World Youth Symphony Orchestra at Interlaken, but I've worked so much with the national orchestras in Romania, with this system that started 11 years ago. And now it's completely revolutionized the music scene in Romania. And I've worked with them many, many times. In fact, we did a tour last year of the United States, and I'm coming to the National Youth Orchestra next year. So it's a I try as much as I can in my schedule to balance out my responsibilities of my job and my work with as much education that I can put out there. And some of my favorite moments of my life are on stage with the 16, 17, 18,
Mm.
12, 10-year olds,
Yeah.
making music. I mean, that's what I love about conducting a young orchestra or a youth orchestra. They don't know what limits are.
No.
They don't understand limits. You throw in Bartok's Wooden Prince and they
Yeah.
play it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And like you would never be able to do that with an amateur orchestra that is probably at the same level or a little better than the youth orchestra. They would never tackle on Bartok Wooden Prince. Like
No.
this would not even, they wouldn't trust themselves that they can do it. And here it is, a youth orchestra, and they just believe in themselves with so much passion and I remember when I was 17 and I thought I should be music director of the Berlin Philharmonic. Like
Yeah.
there is a there is a beautiful belief in yourself that it's required um, when you're young, and I love that in a
Mm.
youth orchestra.
When you come to learn a new score, and because you've been involved with the Cabrillo Festival of Contemporary Music, I'm assuming you have a lot of new scores to learn. When you come to learn those new scores, do you have a system for learning them, or a way of doing it that you find the most comfortable? And the other question I've asked virtually all the conductors is, when you come to learn those new scores, do you write things in your score, or are you one of these people who like to keep their scores blank?
Um, so about studying scores in general, I guess, which
Mm.
informs the new music as well. Um, One of the greatest realizations that I had, I would say, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and it was such a huge liberating moment in my life, is when I realized that there are no two composers that require me to study them in the same way,
Uh,
and that each composer also teaches you how to study their music. Um, and
that's very
and
true. Yeah.
and this was very liberating for me, because then I didn't have to put myself in a straitjacket to look at Mozart's music in the same way that I would look at Stockhausen's music,
Mm.
right? So it opened up many pathways for me to be able to discover and to learn a lot more. Um, my process is, it always comes down to one thing. Um, what is it that I need to do to understand the essence behind this music?
Mm.
What is it that I need to comprehend in order to portray the clearest picture of the emotions, of the underlying message of the
Mm.
piece, the state of mind of the composer, the drama of the context that is driven by historical events. What is it that I need to understand? This, and then I try to come to this simple, if I can call it simple, concept through any means necessary. Now, with some music, you have to go very, very deeply into historical meanings, historical context of understanding why the piece was written. Some pieces don't require that. I remember having a conversation one time with Pierre Boulez and asking him, I said, Maestro, what do you study?
Mm.
And he said, oh, it's very, very simple. He said, I look for structure. He said, I
Mm.
only study structure. And I said, well, I said, thank you. I said, now, can you please tell me, what do you mean? You know,
Yeah.
because conductors like to throw that thing around. They said, oh, well, structure is so important. I said, fine, now define structure for me. Tell me, how do you get there? Right. And then he said, that's interesting question. He said, well, structure will be revealed to you once you've answered all the details. Okay. And that's so true. That's
Mm.
absolutely true. It's amazing. Once you understand why a C major goes to a C minor in this point, or why the harmonic motion is a certain way, or why the pulse of the music is a certain way, and why the character of the rhythm and the articulation is a certain way, then you understand the structure. Like, you can't, sometimes I talk to young conductors who tell me that they look at the score, they understand the structure, and then they try to go deeper into the smaller gestures. And I said, no, that's backwards. Like, start with the small gestures and then don't worry about the structure. The structure will reveal itself when you're ready to see it.
Mm.
I'm a strong believer in that. So that, for me, that's the process. The process for me is to look at the what, which
Mm.
defines the character of the music for me. And this I understand from the rhythm of the piece. The articulation is very important for me to understand in defining the character. Then I'm looking at how, which is the journey for me of the piece. And this is defined by the harmonic motion of the piece, or the lack of harmonic motion of the piece. And then
Mm.
I'm looking at connections that I make, the phrasing structures and things that I can understand in this way. And then ultimately, I love making schemes and charts of dynamics,
Mm.
because dynamics speak so much about the context that we actually have to be in on stage in order to portray what the composer meant to say. So to me, a forte is only loud if it comes after a piano.
Mm.
um, and or a più forte, let's say, is only louder if it comes after a softer dynamic. So and all those things dictate the context, where I think the score is a two-dimensional representation, where the dynamics, the addition of dynamics, create a three-dimensional representation of the music, which is what ultimately we try to do. And with new music is exactly the same,
Mm.
um, in the sense that I try to define the character of the piece. I try to define the context from where it comes from. Then I try to understand the context we have to be in order to perform it. And I try to understand the journey through the harmonic motion, which then hopefully will define the structure of the piece. Some scores I write in because I feel like I need to remember that.
Yeah.
And some scores, I just don't need to write it in. I just
Yeah.
remember it because there's a trigger that it's so evident to me that I
Yes.
don't even have to write it in. So it depends. It depends on the score. I definitely would say that as looking at my own scores, the scores that I felt I was less prepared for are the ones that I've written more in. than the
Right.
ones
Yeah.
that I've studied more.
Yeah.
I feel deeper, and I feel like studying a score and musical knowledge are actually two different aspects of who we are as conductors, and they are strongly intertwined. But the idea is you study a musical score so that you gain musical knowledge, and knowledge then is represented through musical instinct when you are on the podium,
Mm.
because a lot of the decisions that you make, you can't study or plan in advance. These directly speak to the musical instinct that is defined by the knowledge that you've gained through your study of scores overall in your life. Which is why I also I have never really felt like I have understood everything about a piece before I conducted it. But I've also learned to be okay with that,
Mm.
because I know that studying this one score is just one more way of adding to my overall musical knowledge, which then is represented in my instinct about music overall, which will then help me interpret the piece that I'm conducting at the moment.
So, Christy, it is time for the 10 questions. And as ever, I will start with what sound or noise do you love and what sound or noise do you hate?
I love walking through the forest and hearing birds chirping. This is very calming and beautiful to me. I hate the sound that an airplane makes flying above.
If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
Playing with my kids.
And who would be a favourite conductor of yesteryear?
Um, there are many, many that I loved. I would say whenever I think of a conductor that I admired their ability to create a beautiful musical phrase and concept, I come back to Gunther Wand very, very often.
Mm.
So definitely high on my list.
And who would be a favourite current conductor?
I feel like I learn so many things from many, many conductors, but I would say a conductor that has remained a reference for me in my career, that I look up to a lot. Anything they do and everything they do, I listen and I try to understand why. Not everything I would do the same way, but definitely is a reference conductor for me is Simon Rattle, Sir Simon.
What is the hardest work you have ever conducted?
I think from a technical point of view, probably the most challenging one that I did was the Gerald Barry Piano Concerto that I did a couple of years ago. And it was so difficult that as soon as I finished the performance, I immediately went back to my dressing room. I started studying again, and I reprogrammed the piece to be performed a year later, just so that I can, so that just so I see if I can do it again.
Yeah.
But I think from an emotional point of view, um, I don't know if it's difficult, but I have to say, first time I did Trovatore was definitely very difficult,
Mm.
just to really have the confidence and the ability to overcome all your fears of conducting a Verdi opera for the first time, and not just a Verdi opera by Trovatore. So emotionally speaking, I think that was probably one of the most difficult things I've done.
When travelling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
I I always need to have a really great pillow, like a head pillow that I
Mm.
take with me for the road. It doesn't matter um, how short or how long, so I always have this with me. But anything really that makes the actual traveling from point A to point B more enjoyable, meaning um, I wear the most ridiculously comfortable clothes when I travel, and sometimes I look ridiculous, but I don't really care. Getting on the airplane, at least it used to be getting on the airplane, it had to be all about comfort.
Mm.
So comfortable socks, comfortable shoes, comfortable head pillow, soft, sunglasses, so that there's no light, any of that. I'm very obsessed with that idea of comfort while traveling.
What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
Um, you know, uh, if if there would be a way for me to spend more time with my family. And that's the one thing that I think has been a beautiful side effect of the current time that we live in, is that
Mm.
I've been home with my children for almost 9 weeks now. And I really, really love this. And I hope that in the future I will be able to find a good balance where the traveling will be kept at a minimum, while still being able to maintain the relationships that I have with the orchestras that I love and cherish.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Well, I've always loved working with numbers in one way or another. So I love the idea of myself being a architect, or doing something that is both artistic and has to do with mathematics and calculations. And I love mathematics, and algebra is really, I don't know, I just really like it. So something that had to do with balancing those two aspects that are in me, I think would be very satisfying, actually.
And finally, if the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Um, in Romania, every important meal starts with soup, and a really fine, beautiful, clear broth soup would probably be my choice.
Christy, it's been a wonderful, wonderful time talking to you. Fascinating. And I hope to bump into you backstage somewhere again very soon.
Thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate it.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I talk to an English conductor who is equally at home in both the concert hall and the opera house. He has also written articles for newspapers and written a book on the whole subject of why conducting matters. Until then, bye bye.